Do not move. Do not even breathe. Because the man standing 11 feet behind you has no idea that a rifle is already trained on the back of his skull, and in 4 seconds, only one of us walks off this range alive. That was the thought running through Specialist Delaney Cross's mind at 4:17 in the morning, lying flat in frozen scrub grass on a ridge above the Ashwood Proving Ground. Watching a stranger, she was not supposed to be watching through a scope. She was not supposed to be using with this level of precision. Before we go any further, if a story about a young woman hiding in plain sight among the most dangerous marksmen in the United States Army pulls you in the way it is about to, do something for me. Hit subscribe right now and drop a comment telling me what state you are watching from tonight. I want to know exactly how far this one travels, because what happened at Ashwood over the next 4 days changed the way an entire branch of the military thinks about who gets to hold a rifle and who gets overlooked. Wyoming in early spring does not forgive mistakes. The high desert plateau where Ashwood Proving Ground sat, 8,000 feet above sea level and 40 miles from the nearest town anyone had heard of, dropped to freezing most nights even when the days climbed past 60 degrees. The wind never fully stopped. It just changed its mind about which direction it wanted to punish you from. Delaney Cross had been lying in that wind for 6 hours, and she had spent every one of those hours pretending to be something she was not. On paper, she was Specialist Delaney Cross, 22 years old, a mediocre shooter from a support unit out of Fort Carson who had somehow scraped into the Army's most exclusive advanced sniper qualification course by the thinnest possible margin. That was the story printed on her personnel file, the story her instructors believed, the story the other candidates repeated to each other in the mess hall when they wondered aloud why the quiet blonde girl from Colorado had even bothered showing up. Off paper, in a file that existed in exactly one secure server owned by the Army Criminal Investigation Division, she was something else entirely. She was an active undercover operator embedded inside the capstone qualification course to find out why 3 separate optics failures on Army-issue long-range scopes had killed 2 soldiers in the last 18 months, and why the official investigations into all 3 deaths had quietly closed themselves within days. She had been given one instruction before she arrived at Ashwood: delay the course by 36 hours, cause 0 casualties, do not explain why. She had burned the printed orders in a metal trash can behind the CID field office in Cheyenne before driving north, and she had not been given a reason, only a name to remember: Task Force Draven. She did not know yet what it meant. She only knew that someone above her pay grade was frightened enough of it to send her in blind. The man she was watching through her scope that morning was not a candidate. He wore no unit patch, no name tape, nothing that would identify him to the 11 exhausted young soldiers sleeping in tents 400 meters below the ridge. He moved like someone who had done this exact kind of movement 1,000 times before, low and unhurried, checking his footing before every step the way infantry taught you and special operations perfected. Delaney watched him for 11 minutes without firing, without moving, without doing anything except breathing slow and shallow and cataloging every detail her training had ever given her. 6 feet tall, left-handed, a faint scar bisecting his right eyebrow, a radio earpiece that was not standard Army issue. Then he turned, and for exactly 1/2 second, he looked directly up the slope toward her position, and Delaney understood with total clarity that either he had not seen her or he had, and either possibility terrified her in a different way. She did not fire. She held her breath, counted to 9, and watched him turn away and continue down the ridge toward the tents where 11 soldiers and their instructor slept without any idea that someone who did not belong there was walking among them in the dark. That instructor was Master Sergeant Silas Vance, And by the time the sun came up over Ashwood 2 hours later, every soldier on that plateau would have a story to tell about him for the rest of their careers. Vance was 54 years old, built like something carved rather than born, with gray stubble that never quite grew into a beard and eyes that had the particular stillness of a man who had made peace with things most people spent their lives running from. In the sniper community, a world where excellence was simply the entry fee and anything less got you sent home, Vance's name still carried weight the way certain names carry weight in small, dangerous professions. Instructors 2 decades younger than him still told stories about shots he had made in places officially described only as classified locations, shots that other operators swore were not physically possible until they watched the after-action video themselves. They did not call him legendary to his face. He would have hated that. What they called him, quietly, respectfully, was the ghost of Kandahar Ridge, though nobody currently serving remembered exactly why, and Vance himself never explained it. He simply let the silence answer for him, the way he let silence answer most things. What almost nobody at Ashwood knew, because Vance had never told them and the Army had classified the incident report so thoroughly that even his own personnel file listed it under a generic training accident, was that 4 years earlier his son had died, wearing the same uniform Vance had spent 30 years defending. Corporal Ethan Vance, 23 years old, had been killed during a live-fire exercise when the optic mounted on his issued rifle failed catastrophically during a low-light engagement, sending a round 11 inches off target directly into a support beam that ricocheted into Ethan's chest. The Army had ruled it an unfortunate mechanical failure. Vance had read the incident report 7 times and found 7 different places where the language did not quite make sense. 7 small gaps that a grieving father with 3 decades of weapons expertise could see clearly even when nobody else was looking. He had asked questions. The questions had gone nowhere. Eventually, he had done what men like Vance do when an institution refuses to give them an answer. He buried it, put his uniform back on, and became the kind of instructor who checked every single optic personally before he let a candidate near a rifle range, though he never told anyone why. At 05:30 that morning, standing in front of 11 exhausted candidates lined up outside the tents in the gray pre-dawn cold, Vance did the thing he did on the first full day of every capstone course. He walked the line slowly, looking each candidate directly in the eye for 3 full seconds, saying nothing, letting the silence do what silence always did to nervous young soldiers who had not slept properly in 2 days. He stopped in front of Delaney, crossed longer than he stopped in front of anyone else. Something about her did not add up, and Vance had spent 30 years developing an instinct for things that did not add up. Her file said mediocre marksman, borderline qualification scores, a support unit posting that suggested someone with more paperwork skill than trigger discipline. But her stance was wrong for that story. Her feet were positioned exactly the way a trained shooter positioned them without thinking, weight balanced, hips square, the unconscious readiness of someone who had spent thousands of hours doing this and had simply forgotten how to hide it completely. "You," he said, his voice flat and quiet. "Cross, step forward." She stepped forward, keeping her eyes fixed somewhere just past his shoulder the way every nervous candidate was trained to do. "Your qual scores say you barely made the cutoff," Vance said. "Your file says support unit, logistics adjacent, minimal field time." He paused. "Your feet say something else." For 1/2 second, something flickered behind Delaney's eyes, gone before Vance could fully read it. But he had seen enough flickers in enough eyes over 30 years to know he had seen something real. "Just nervous, sir," she said. Vance held her gaze for a long moment that felt considerably longer than it actually was. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that ends a conversation without actually resolving it, and moved down the line to the next candidate. But he did not forget. Men like Vance never forgot the moments that did not add up. He simply filed it away, the way he filed away everything, and waited to see what it would eventually become. The capstone course began at 0600 with a static range qualification designed to weed out anyone whose fundamentals had eroded overnight. And it was here that Delaney made her first deliberate mistake of the mission. She had one shot to establish herself as unremarkable, and unremarkable was exactly what the mission required. At 600 meters, in wind gusting unpredictably at 12 to 18 miles an hour, she settled behind her issued rifle and made the calculations that 15 years of unofficial training, most of it taught to her outside any Army classroom by a grandfather who had served 2 tours as a Marine Corps scout sniper before she was even born, told her would produce a clean center mass hit. Then she deliberately shifted her hold 4 inches low and left, squeezed the trigger, and watched her round punch into the outer ring of the target instead of the center. Miss inside the qualifying zone, the range officer called out, "Barely." Barely qualified was exactly the story Delaney needed the range to tell about her, and she felt the small, cold satisfaction of a plan working even as something in her chest tightened at how easily she had just lied to a room full of professionals with nothing but the angle of a rifle. Beside her on the firing line, Private Jonah Teague, 20 years old, freckled, earnest in the specific unguarded way that young soldiers are before the job teaches them otherwise, glanced over with an expression that was trying very hard to be encouraging. "Rough one," he said quietly. "You'll get the next." "Thanks," Delaney said, and meant it, because something about Teague's plain decency made her chest ache with a guilt she had no time to feel. The morning moved forward the way military mornings do, structured and exhausting and full of small humiliations designed to reveal character under pressure. It was during the mid-morning land navigation exercise, deep in a stand of lodgepole pines a mile east of the main range, that Delaney found the first hard piece of evidence that something at Ashwood was badly wrong. She was moving alone through the trees, map and compass in hand, when she stepped over a fallen log and found a boot print in the soft earth beneath it that did not belong to anyone on the roster. Standard Army boot tread, but the size and the wear pattern were wrong, and there were 2 prints, moving in a direction that led away from the training area entirely, toward a section of the map marked simply as restricted terrain, no explanation given. She crouched, photographed the print with a small covert camera hidden in her canteen pouch, and felt her pulse climb in a way 6 years of undercover work had taught her to recognize as instinct rather than fear. Someone was here who was not supposed to be here, and judging by the confidence of the stride, whoever it was had been here before. That afternoon, during a scheduled rest period, Delaney did something she had done exactly twice before in 6 years of undercover operations, both times when a mission's risk profile had shifted so severely that protocol demanded immediate contact. She walked half a mile beyond the tree line, found a dead zone in the canyon wall that would block line of sight from camp, and pulled a compact satellite radio from a hidden seam in her rucksack. The voice on the other end belonged to her CID handler, a woman named Rourke who Delaney had met exactly once, in a parking garage in Denver, and had spoken to perhaps a dozen times since through channels designed to leave no trace. "Talk to me," Rourke said. "There are people here who aren't in the roster," Delaney said quietly, her voice barely above a breath. "2 of them minimum, trained, not candidates, moving with purpose toward the restricted section on the northeast quadrant." A pause on the line, longer than Delaney liked. "Stay embedded," Rourke finally said. "Do not engage. Do not investigate the restricted zone yourself. We are still 36 hours from being ready to move on this. Ready to move on what? Delaney said. It was not really a question. She had asked variations of it 4 times since accepting this assignment, and she had received the same answer every time. You'll know when it matters, Rourke said. Your only job right now is delay and observation, nothing more. The line went dead, and Delaney stood alone in the canyon with the wind pulling at her jacket, feeling the particular loneliness of someone who has been asked to trust a plan she is not permitted to fully understand. She did not know it yet, but 300 meters away, on the other side of a granite outcrop, Master Sergeant Vance had followed her. He had noticed her slip away from the rest area with the practiced ease of someone who had done exactly this kind of quiet departure before, and his instincts, the same instincts that had once kept an entire team alive in a valley whose name was still classified, told him to follow. He had not heard the content of her radio call, only the tone, tense and controlled in a way that no genuinely nervous, barely qualifying candidate should have been capable of. He watched her return to camp with her expression perfectly composed, and he filed away one more piece of a puzzle he was only beginning to realize existed. The second night at Ashwood brought the field exercise that would change everything. Candidates were split into 2-person teams and given a simulated infiltration scenario, moving through 9 miles of broken terrain in full darkness to reach an observation point before dawn, avoiding a roaming opposing force meant to simulate enemy patrols. Delaney was paired with Teague, and though the pairing had been randomly assigned by roster order, she would later understand that nothing at Ashwood that week had actually been random. They moved well together, better than either of them expected, Teague's raw enthusiasm balanced by Delaney's controlled, economical movement, the kind of movement that came from someone who had spent far more nights than she should have already learning how silence worked in wild terrain. Around midnight, crossing a shallow ravine choked with deadfall, Teague froze mid-step and raised a closed fist, the universal signal for stop. "Someone's out there," he whispered, "not one of ours." Delaney went still, every sense sharpening the way they had been trained to sharpen since she was 14 years old on her grandfather's ranch, learning to read wind and shadow and the specific silence that precedes danger. Through a gap in the deadfall, 40 meters out, she saw a shape moving with the wrong kind of confidence for a simulation. Whoever it was, they were not moving like an instructor role-playing an enemy patrol. They were moving like someone who had done this in a country where the mistakes were permanent. "Get down," Delaney breathed, and pulled Teague low behind a fallen trunk with a hand on his shoulder that carried more authority than a barely qualifying support soldier should have possessed. The figure passed within 30 feet of them and did not see them, moving on toward the northeast quadrant, toward the restricted section Delaney had already flagged that morning. When the danger had passed, Teague turned to her with wide eyes. "How did you know exactly where to pull me?" he whispered. "That spot behind the log, that was perfect cover. I didn't even see it until you already had us there." Delaney's mind moved fast, searching for a lie that would hold. "Lucky guess," she said. Teague studied her for a moment in the darkness, and something in his young, open face shifted, not suspicion exactly, but the first small crack of a question he did not yet know how to ask. They continued the exercise, and Delaney spent the rest of that walk in the particular cold state of a professional who understands that her cover, carefully constructed over weeks of preparation, had just developed its first visible fracture. Master Sergeant Vance was watching that fracture happen in real time, though he did not know it yet. Positioned on high ground overlooking the exercise corridor, using a thermal scope to track team movement for the after-action review, he watched 2 heat signatures freeze, drop, and reposition with a fluidity that no barely qualifying support soldier should have possessed. He lowered the scope slowly, and for the first time since the course began, allowed himself to fully articulate the thought he had been circling since that first morning on the line. Whoever Delaney Cross actually was, she was not who her file said she was. And the man moving through the northeast quadrant, the one his own instincts told him did not belong on this range any more than she did, might be the reason why. The final major event of the first day came just before dawn, in the gray hour when exhaustion makes everyone slightly less careful than they should be. The full course of 11 candidates had reconvened at the primary firing range for a live fire qualification exercise. And it was here, under Vance's direct supervision, that a man Delaney had never seen before walked casually onto the observation platform wearing a visitor badge and an Army-issued jacket 2 sizes too clean for someone who claimed to have flown in from a range inspection office in Colorado. He introduced himself to Vance as Cade Osgood, an equipment liaison from Draven Systems Defense Solutions, there to observe the performance of a new optic system the company was field testing on select candidate rifles. His handshake was firm, his smile professional, his eyes moving across the assembled soldiers with a scanning quality that had nothing to do with equipment inspection and everything to do with target assessment. Delaney recognized his stance immediately. It was the same stance she had watched through her scope at 417 that morning, 6 feet tall, left-handed, a faint scar through his right eyebrow. He looked directly at her for 1/2 second longer than protocol would require, and something passed behind his eyes that told Delaney with absolute certainty that he recognized her too, that somewhere in the last 24 hours he had learned enough to know exactly who and what she actually was. She kept her expression perfectly blank, the way 6 years of training had taught her, and turned back toward the firing line as though nothing at all had just happened. But her heart was hammering, and her mind was already running through the math of what came next. Draven Systems. The name Rourke had refused to say out loud on an open channel. The same company, she now understood with cold certainty, whose defective optics had killed 2 soldiers and would have killed a third if fate had bent even slightly differently, was standing 11 feet away from her wearing a visitor badge and a smile that did not reach his eyes. The qualification exercise proceeded. Candidates fired in sequence, their scores called out by the range officer, the ordinary rhythm of a training day continuing exactly as it should. But underneath that ordinary rhythm, 3 separate people on that firing line now understood that something at Ashwood had shifted into a different kind of danger. Vance, watching Osgood with the particular flat attention of a man cataloging a threat. Delaney, calculating how much time her cover had left before it collapsed entirely. And Osgood himself, standing in plain sight among 11 young soldiers, already deciding what he was going to do about the young woman who had almost put a bullet through the back of his skull 12 hours earlier without ever knowing his name. It was Teague's turn to fire, and as he settled behind his rifle, Delaney watched Osgood's gaze drift toward the young private with an assessing coldness that had nothing to do with equipment testing. Then, without warning, Osgood stepped forward and spoke directly to Vance, his voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby candidates to hear. "Actually," he said, "I'd like to see the girl shoot first. Cross, was it? I hear her scores have been inconsistent. Might be worth understanding why for the equipment report." Every head on the range turned toward Delaney. Vance's eyes moved from Osgood to Delaney and back again, and in that half-second of silence, something passed between the old instructor and the young woman he had already begun to suspect was not what her file claimed, something unspoken but absolutely clear. He understood, with the sudden clarity of a man whose instincts had just connected every fractured piece of the last 24 hours into a single terrible shape, that the visitor standing beside him was not here to test equipment at all. He was here because of her. And Delaney, walking toward the firing line with 11 pairs of eyes and one very dangerous stranger watching her every movement, understood exactly the same thing at exactly the same moment, that the 36 hours of careful invisibility she had been ordered to maintain had just run out, 12 hours ahead of schedule, on a wind-scoured range in the middle of Wyoming. With nobody coming to help her, and no way to know, yet, whether the man watching her settle behind the rifle already knew enough to kill her before the sun finished rising. No one on that firing line moved for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds Delaney Cross understood that the entire mission, 6 weeks of preparation, a dead father figure's worth of grandfather training, and 36 hours of careful invisibility, had just come down to how well she could lie with a rifle in her hands in front of the one man at Ashwood dangerous enough to already suspect the truth. She settled behind the weapon. The wind had picked up since dawn, gusting hard from the northwest, the kind of wind that punished anyone who trusted their first read of it. 600 meters downrange, the target waited, small and indifferent. Osgood stood at the edge of the firing line with his visitor badge and his clean jacket, watching her with the stillness of a man who already believed he knew how the next 30 seconds would end. Delaney breathed once, twice, felt the old rhythm her grandfather had beaten into her on a Colorado ranch before she was old enough to drive, and made a decision that surprised even her. She was done pretending to be worse than she was, not because pride demanded it, because instinct did. Something in Osgood's stance told her that a visibly mediocre shooter would only invite closer inspection, the way a wounded animal invites attention rather than deflecting it. The only way through this moment was competence sharp enough to make him hesitate. She fired. The round found center mass exactly where 15 years of unofficial training said it would. She worked the bolt, adjusted a half degree for the gust that had just shifted, and fired again. Center mass. A third round, same result. The range officer called the score in a voice that had gone slightly flat with surprise. Vance said nothing at all, but something behind his eyes sharpened into quiet, terrible understanding, the last piece of a puzzle locking into place. Osgood's expression did not change, but Delaney saw the small tightening at the corner of his mouth, a man revising his risk assessment in real time. Around them, the other 10 candidates had gone very quiet. Delaney felt it without looking, the specific weight of 9 strangers suddenly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the quiet blonde from Colorado who barely qualified. She would think about that weight often over the next 2 days, the way a lie, once cracked, does not stay contained to the people who needed to hear the truth. "Interesting," Osgood said quietly, to no one in particular. Then he turned and walked off the range without another word, and Delaney watched him go with her pulse hammering beneath a face she kept perfectly still. That afternoon, Vance found her alone at the equipment shed, cleaning her rifle with the mechanical focus of someone trying not to think. He did not ask permission before sitting down across from her on an overturned ammunition crate. For a long moment he said nothing, simply watched her hands work the cleaning rod through the barrel with a precision that no borderline qualifier should have possessed. "You are not who your file says you are," he said finally. It was not a question, and he did not raise his voice. Delaney kept her eyes on the rifle. "Sir, I do not know what you mean." "I have trained shooters for 22 years, Vance said. "I know what natural competence looks like when someone is trying to hide it. You have been hiding it since the moment you arrived. And that man from Draven Systems looked at you this morning like you were a problem he needed to solve, not a candidate he needed to evaluate." She set the cleaning rod down slowly. "I cannot tell you anything," she said, "and I need you to trust me anyway. That is not fair to ask. I know it is not." Vance studied her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifted, not suspicion anymore, but the recognition of a man who has spent 4 years quietly investigating his own son's death and has learned to know the shape of a cover story built around a real and dangerous truth. "My son died wearing this uniform," he said, his voice dropping into a register Delaney had not heard from him before. "4 years ago. Live fire exercise. The Army called it a mechanical failure and closed the file in 11 days. He paused, and for 1/2 second something raw moved across his face before he pulled it back under control. "I read that report 7 times. There were 7 things in it that did not make sense. 7 small gaps that nobody with a badge ever wanted to explain to me." Delaney felt something cold settle into her chest, 2 separate threads of investigation suddenly discovering they were the same thread. "What was your son's name?" she asked quietly, though some part of her already knew the answer would matter more than any question she had asked since arriving at Ashwood. "Ethan Vance said, Corporal Ethan Vance." The name landed in Delaney's memory like a stone dropped into still water, because she had seen that name once before, printed in a file she had reviewed for exactly 4 minutes in a secure room in Cheyenne, before Rourke had taken it back and told her not to ask questions yet. Corporal Ethan Vance. Optic failure. Same defective component lot number as the 2 deaths that had triggered her entire assignment. She did not tell him that. Not yet. She could not without violating every protocol keeping this investigation alive, and not without potentially getting them both killed if the wrong person overheard. But something in her expression must have shifted, because Vance leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You know something," he said. It was not a question either. "I need 36 hours, Delaney said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to trust me for 36 hours, and then I promise you will understand everything, including why your son's death matters to what is happening on this range right now." There was one more thing she nearly told him then, and stopped herself. 6 weeks earlier, in a briefing room in Cheyenne, Rourke had shown her a personnel roster for the Ashwood Capstone course, and had circled one name before Delaney ever set foot on the plateau. Vance. Rourke had said only that his presence on the instructor roster made this assignment survivable, that a man with his record and his grief would not look away once the truth reached him, and that CID had quietly arranged, through channels Delaney did not fully understand, for him to be assigned to this particular course specifically because he was the one instructor in the entire Army who would refuse to bury it a second time. She did not tell him that yet either. It felt too much like using his son's memory as a tool, even though it was also simply true. Vance held her gaze for a long moment, and something old and exhausted and desperately hopeful moved behind his eyes, the look of a man who had spent 4 years being told to let go of a question that would not let go of him. 36 hours, he said finally. Then he stood, and before he walked away, he added one more sentence, quiet and flat and heavier than anything else he had said. "Do not make me regret trusting a stranger over the Army that raised me." He left her alone with the rifle and the wind, and a weight in her chest that had nothing to do with the mission, and everything to do with the grief of a father who did not yet know how close he stood to the truth. That evening, during a scheduled equipment maintenance period, Delaney slipped away from camp under the cover of a supply run and made her way northeast, toward the restricted quadrant she had flagged the day before. She knew it violated Rourke's explicit instruction not to investigate the zone herself. She went anyway, because Osgood's presence had accelerated every timeline the mission had been built around, and because Vance's grief had just made this personal in a way it had not been 24 hours earlier. The terrain climbed sharply through a stand of dead timber before dropping into a narrow limestone canyon that did not appear on any map she had been issued. She moved low and silent until she found it. A reinforced steel door set into the canyon wall, painted to match the surrounding rock, guarded by a single man in tactical gear who was clearly not army, standing with the relaxed alertness of hired professional muscle rather than trained infantry. She watched from cover for 11 minutes, cataloging everything. The guard's rotation pattern, the small satellite dish mounted discreetly above the door, the faint hum of a generator running somewhere beneath the rock. This was not a training facility. This was something built and maintained in complete secrecy, hidden inside a live fire range where nobody would think to look twice at unexplained restricted terrain. Then the door opened, and Delaney's breath caught in her throat. A woman stepped out under armed escort, moving slowly, wearing civilian clothes that had clearly not been changed in days. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, exhausted in the way of someone who has been held somewhere against their will for far too long. Delaney recognized her instantly from a briefing photo she had memorized weeks earlier in Cheyenne. Dr. Naomi Petrov, ballistics engineer. The whistleblower who had disappeared from public record 6 weeks ago after filing an internal complaint with Draven Systems about optic failure rates in a component batch. The company had rushed to production ahead of a major government contract renewal. Petrov had not disappeared. She had been taken, and she was being held here, inside a training range crawling with soldiers who had no idea she existed. Delaney photographed the scene with shaking hands, retreated the way she had come, and did not stop moving until she reached the dead zone in the canyon wall where her radio would work. Rourke answered on the second ring. "I found her," Delaney breathed. "Petrov, alive, being held in a bunker inside the restricted zone, guarded by contractors, not army personnel." A long silence on the line. Then Rourke's voice came back, and for the first time since Delaney had accepted this assignment, it carried something that sounded almost like fear. "You are not supposed to find her yet," Rourke said. "The extraction team is not staged. Full support is still 36 hours out on the standard timeline. But listen to me carefully, Cross. There is a contingency response cell already positioned 2 hours from Ashwood, held in reserve specifically in case your cover broke early. They cannot move without a triggering event, something undeniable, an armed confrontation, a shot fired, proof this has gone hot. Until that happens, they stay dark and you stay alone. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I understand," Delaney said, and something in her chest went very still, because she understood exactly what Rourke was telling her. If this broke, it would break fast, and the difference between 36 hours and 40 minutes would come down entirely to how loudly it broke. "Hold position," Rourke said. "Do not engage. Do not free her yet. If they suspect you know, your cover is the only thing keeping her alive right now. If you break it early without a trigger the response cell can act on, you are on your own until the standard timeline catches up." The line went dead, and Delaney stood alone in the canyon with the wind pulling at her jacket, carrying the weight of a decision she had not been given the option to make. She had to survive inside a training exercise run by a legendary instructor who was beginning to suspect everything, watched by a mercenary who already knew too much, while a kidnapped engineer sat in a bunker 200 meters from where 11 candidates slept without any idea what was actually happening around them. And the only thing standing between chaos and rescue was a trigger event she prayed she would not have to be the one who caused. She made her way back toward camp in the dark, and it was there, moving through the tree line with her mind racing through contingencies, that she nearly walked directly into Jonah Teague, standing alone in the shadows with an expression that told her immediately he had seen exactly where she had come from. "You went northeast," he said quietly, "toward the restricted zone. I followed you partway before I lost you." His young face was caught between confusion and something sharper, something closer to betrayal. "What is going on, Cross? Because nothing about you adds up anymore, and I am done pretending I have not noticed." Delaney's mind raced through every possible lie and rejected each one, because Teague deserved better than another lie. "I cannot tell you everything," she said quietly, "but I need you to trust me, and I need you to not tell anyone what you saw tonight. Not Vance, not the other candidates. Nobody. Lives depend on it. Real lives, Jonah, not a training exercise." Teague studied her for a long moment, his jaw tight. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay. But if this gets me killed, I want you to know I am blaming you specifically." Despite everything, Delaney felt something that was almost a laugh rise and die in her throat. "Fair," she said. They walked back into camp separately, 5 minutes apart, and neither of them slept that night. The next morning brought the event that shattered whatever fragile equilibrium had held Ashwood together for 2 days. At 0800, the entire course was summoned to the main briefing tent for an unscheduled announcement, and Delaney felt her stomach drop the moment she saw who was standing at the front of the room beside Colonel Grant Ashford. Brigadier General Foster Lange had arrived by helicopter 40 minutes earlier, standing now in a uniform pressed sharp enough to look freshly issued, flanked by 2 aides and, unmistakably, by Cade Osgood, who had exchanged his visitor badge for the confident bearing of a man who belonged wherever he chose to stand. Colonel Ashford, 55 years old, weathered and precise in the way career officers become after 3 decades of learning exactly how much of themselves an institution required, cleared his throat and addressed the room in a flat professional cadence. "Effective immediately," Ashford said, "the northeast quadrant of this facility is being designated a live equipment testing zone under General Lange's direct authority. All candidates will restrict movement to the primary training area until further notice. This is a security matter and will not be discussed further." Delaney's eyes moved to Vance, standing near the back of the tent, and she watched something harden behind his expression. A general he had never had reason to distrust had just personally authorized restricted access to the exact area where a kidnapped engineer was being held by armed men who were not Army personnel, escorted there by the same defense contractor whose optics had killed his son. After the briefing dispersed, Vance found a private moment to intercept Ashford outside the tent, and Delaney positioned herself close enough to hear without appearing to listen, her heart pounding. "Grant," Vance said quietly, "what exactly is Draven Systems testing back there that requires a general to fly in personally and lock down half the range?" Ashford's expression flickered. "Above my clearance too, Silas," he said, his voice dropping. "Lange handed me a directive this morning with a classification stamp I have never seen used at this facility before. I sign what I am told to sign. That is the job." "That is the job that got Ethan killed," Vance said, quiet and hard, and Ashford flinched visibly, the words landing somewhere old and unhealed. "I know," Ashford said. "I know, Silas, and I am telling you I do not like this any more than you do. But I do not have the authority to refuse a general's directive without cause, and right now I have no cause except a bad feeling." "Then get me cause," Vance said, and walked away before Ashford could answer. Delaney watched the exchange from 20 feet away, and something in her chest tightened with a realization she had not expected. Colonel Ashford was not a villain in this story. He was exactly what institutions produced when men and women of genuine decency were asked to trust a chain of command that had already been quietly corrupted above them. He had signed away access to a kidnapped woman's prison without ever understanding what he was signing, and that unwitting complicity was, in its own way, more disturbing than open malice would have been. The day's training continued under the strange, brittle tension of 11 candidates, who could all feel that something had shifted without understanding what. It was during the midday tactical movement exercise, moving in staggered formation through a boulder field on the western edge of the range, that Delaney executed the moment that would later be described by every soldier present as the single most extraordinary thing they witnessed at Ashwood. Osgood had positioned himself as an observer for the exercise, walking the boulder field alongside Vance under the pretense of assessing equipment performance in rough terrain. Delaney understood immediately that his real purpose was to watch her, to confirm whatever suspicion had been building since the range that morning. She needed to give him something that would either confirm her as harmless or terrify him into hesitation, and she made her choice in less than 2 seconds. 700 meters across the boulder field, mounted on a support post nearly invisible against the gray rock, sat a small relay antenna, the kind used to boost radio signal across dead zones exactly like the canyon where Delaney had made her calls to Rourke. She recognized it instantly for what it was, a listening device, positioned to intercept exactly the kind of communication she had been making. Without breaking stride, without asking permission, Delaney raised her rifle in one fluid motion, found the antenna in her scope across 700 meters of shifting wind and broken light, and fired a single round that severed it cleanly at its base. The crack of the shot rolled across the boulder field and died against the canyon walls. For a full 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Vance turned slowly toward her, his expression unreadable, while Osgood's composed mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something underneath that looked, for the first time since Delaney had met him, genuinely alarmed. "Equipment malfunction," Delaney said flatly, lowering her rifle. "Thought I saw movement near the target zone. My mistake." Nobody believed her. Nobody said otherwise. Around them, several of the other candidates exchanged glances that told Delaney the story of the mediocre girl from Colorado had officially, permanently ended among this class, whatever else happened next. That night, alone at the edge of camp, Vance found Delaney again, and this time he did not sit down slowly or ease into the conversation. He simply spoke, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who has spent an entire day watching every certainty he built his life around begin to crack. "You just destroyed a piece of surveillance equipment in front of a general's personal contractor," he said. "That was not an accident, and we both know it." "I know," Delaney said quietly. "That equipment was listening to something," Vance said. "Something they did not want overheard. Which means whatever is happening in that restricted zone is bigger than one dead soldier's optics report, is not it?" Delaney turned to look at him fully for the first time, and something in her decided, on that dark, cold ridge, that Vance had earned more of the truth than protocol allowed her to give. "There is a woman being held in that bunker," she said quietly. "An engineer. She tried to report that Draven Systems shipped a defective optic component knowing it was defective, to meet a production deadline for a contract renewal worth more money than either of us will see in our lifetimes. She disappeared 6 weeks ago. She is alive back there, right now, guarded by men who are not soldiers." Vance went very still, staring out into the dark toward the northeast quadrant with an expression Delaney would remember for the rest of her life. A father discovering that the death he had spent 4 years quietly investigating was not an isolated tragedy, but a single data point in something far larger and far more deliberate. "The same component," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "The optic that killed Ethan. That is what this is." "I believe so," Delaney said. "There is one more thing you should know," she added, because some part of her decided in that moment that he had earned this too. "CID chose this course specifically because you were teaching it. They knew that if the truth ever reached you, you would not let it be buried again. Someone above my rank arranged for you to be standing exactly where you are standing right now." Vance closed his eyes at that, something moving through his face that was grief and fury, and underneath both, a strange and unexpected comfort, the knowledge that his 4 years of quiet, unanswered questioning had not gone entirely unnoticed after all. "They used my son to get me here," he said slowly. "They used your integrity," Delaney said, "which is not the same thing, even if it does not feel that way tonight." Vance was quiet for a long moment, then softer. "Tell me what you need." Before Delaney could answer, a sound cracked through the darkness from the direction of camp, a single gunshot, followed immediately by panicked shouting, and both of them were already moving before either could speak another word, sprinting through the dark toward whatever had just gone catastrophically wrong. They reached the edge of camp to find Teague on the ground, clutching his shoulder, blood dark against his jacket in the moonlight, while two of Osgood's men stood over him with weapons raised. He was asking questions, one of the men said flatly, addressing Osgood, who had appeared from the direction of the command tent with the unhurried calm of a man who had expected exactly this outcome. "Wrong questions. About the restricted zone." Osgood looked down at Teague, bleeding on the frozen ground, then lifted his eyes to find Delaney standing at the tree line, and whatever remained of his professional mask fell away completely. "You should have kept your friend out of this, Cross," he said quietly. "Or should I use your real designation? CID does not typically send support unit rejects to investigate defense contractors. Somebody higher than you made a very serious mistake sending someone this green into something this dangerous." Delaney's blood went cold because there was no more pretending left to do. Osgood knew everything. Teague was bleeding on the ground, and somewhere in her jacket pocket, her radio sat silent, waiting for exactly the kind of trigger event Rourke had warned her would be needed before anyone came to help. Vance stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between Osgood's armed men and both Delaney and the wounded boy on the ground. "You just shot an unarmed soldier under my command," he said, low and absolutely level, "on a United States Army training facility. Whatever you think you are protecting, it just became infinitely more expensive to protect it." Osgood's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes calculated, recalculated, and settled. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, "we stop pretending this is a training exercise." Somewhere in the darkness beyond camp, radios crackled to life, and the sound of at least 6 sets of boots began moving through the tree line with purpose, converging on their position from multiple directions. Delaney reached into her jacket, found her radio, and pressed the transmit button with hands that did not shake despite everything. "Trigger event confirmed," she said into the dark. "Shots fired. Soldier down. Move now." Somewhere 2 hours away, in a staging area Delaney would never see, a response cell that had been sitting dark and waiting finally began to move, and Delaney understood with total freezing clarity that whatever time remained before that help arrived, it would have to be enough. 6 sets of boots closing through darkness from 3 directions, a wounded boy bleeding into frozen ground, and one contractor who had just stopped pretending any of this was a training exercise. That was the exact moment Delaney Cross understood there was no version of the next hour that ended without gunfire, and no version of the next hour where the response cell Rourke had promised would arrive before it mattered. She moved before she finished the thought, dropping low and dragging Teague by his good arm into the shallow cover of an overturned supply crate, feeling the wet heat of his blood soak through her sleeve, hearing him grit out a sound he refused to let become a scream. Vance was already moving in the opposite direction, putting himself between the approaching boots and the two of them, and for 1/2 second Delaney saw something in the old instructor's face that had nothing left of the tired, grieving man from the Boulder field. What remained was something colder and infinitely more dangerous. 30 years of buried skill, finally given permission to surface. "Get him to the rock line," Vance said, his voice flat and certain. "I will hold here." "You will die here," Delaney said. "Then I die knowing why my son did," Vance said, and there was nothing left to argue with in that sentence. She dragged Teague 20 meters through frozen scrub, while the first exchange of gunfire cracked across the camp behind her, Vance's rifle answering two others in quick, economical bursts that told Delaney everything she needed to know about how much of his legend had been earned rather than told. She got Teague behind a limestone outcrop, pressed her jacket hard against the wound in his shoulder, and felt him grab her wrist with more strength than a boy losing blood should have had. "Go," he said through his teeth. "Go do whatever it is you actually came here to do. I will live. Go." She looked at him for exactly 1 second, long enough to memorize the bravery of a 20-year-old private who had trusted a stranger's word over every comfortable explanation the Army had ever given him. And then she was moving, back into the dark, toward the sound of Vance's rifle, and the fight neither of them could survive alone. She found him pinned behind a supply truck, two of Osgood's men working to flank him from opposite sides, while a third laid down suppressing fire from the tree line. Delaney did the math in less than a second, the way 6 years of training had taught her to do math that mattered. She had one working position, 40 meters out, elevated, with a clean line on the flanking man closing from the east. She did not hesitate. She raised her rifle, found him in the dark through nothing but muzzle flash and instinct, and fired once. The man dropped and did not move again. Vance used the half-second of confusion to put down the second flanker with a shot Delaney would later describe, when asked by people who would never quite believe her, as the cleanest piece of shooting she had ever witnessed a human being perform under fire. The third man broke and ran for the tree line, and neither of them chased him, because chasing him was not the mission, and both of them understood that with the same silent clarity. Silence dropped over the camp, broken only by wind and Vance's ragged breathing, and somewhere in the dark behind them, Teague's voice calling out weakly that he was still alive. Around the perimeter, Delaney caught glimpses of the other candidates, awake now and armed, holding the secure inner line Ashford had ordered before any of this began, doing exactly what young soldiers under fire for the first time are trained to do, following orders and holding position, and trusting the two people who actually knew what was happening to handle the parts they could not. "Osgood is not finished," Vance said, checking his weapon with hands that did not shake despite everything. "He came here with more than 3 men, and Petrov is still in that bunker." "Then we go get her," Delaney said, "before Ashford has to sign anything else he does not understand." They found Colonel Ashford awake and half-dressed outside the command tent, radio pressed to his ear, his face carrying the gray shock of a man who has just heard gunfire on a facility he commands and has not yet been told why. Delaney did not give him time to ask questions. She told him everything in under 90 seconds, flat and fast: Petrov, the bunker, the defective optics, General Lange's signature on a directive that had unknowingly authorized a kidnapping to continue under his own command. Ashford's face went through several stages of disbelief before settling into something that looked, for the first time since Delaney had met him, like genuine and terrible clarity. "I signed that," he said quietly. "I signed it because a general told me to, and I trusted the uniform more than my own instincts." "You are not the villain in this, Colonel," Delaney said, and meant it. "But you are the only officer on this range with the authority to override whatever Lange authorized. And right now, that authority is the only thing standing between Dr. Petrov and men who have already decided that killing a soldier under your command, was an acceptable cost of doing business. Ashford looked at her for a long moment, then at Vance, whose loyalty he had apparently never once had cause to question in 20 years of service together, and something settled behind his eyes, a career officer choosing, finally and completely, which side of an institution he was willing to stand on when the institution itself had gone wrong. "Tell me what you need," he said. The plan that formed in the next 4 minutes was not elegant. Ashford would use his command authority to order all remaining candidates confined to the secure inner perimeter, cutting off Osgood's ability to use the wider camp as cover. Two of the young soldiers, a quiet, sturdy candidate named Priya Malhotra, and a wiry former infantryman named Rusty Callahan, both of whom had spent 2 days watching Delaney with the same disbelief as everyone else, volunteered without being asked to help hold that line, and Ashford, after a single hard look at both of them, said only, "Hold it and do not be heroes," which both of them accepted as the highest praise either had received in weeks. Vance would move with 2 trusted range instructors to secure the primary access road, preventing reinforcement or extraction, and Delaney alone would go for the bunker itself, because Petrov's life was now measured in minutes, not hours. "I am not sending a 22-year-old undercover operator into an armed compound alone," Vance said, his voice hard. "You are not sending me," Delaney said. "I am going. There is a difference and you know it." Vance held her gaze for a long moment. "Then you come back," he said. "That is not a request." She moved through the canyon alone 20 minutes later, following the same route she had taken the night before. The guard rotation had changed since her first observation, tighter now, more alert. She counted 3 visible guards instead of the original one. She took the first from 400 meters in complete darkness, a single round to his upper chest that dropped him without a sound loud enough to carry, and moved forward before his partner had fully registered that something was wrong. The second guard she took at close range, a brutal, silent struggle in the dark that ended with her forearm across his throat, and 11 long seconds of stillness before he stopped fighting entirely, the kind of ugly, intimate violence no training video ever fully prepares a soldier for. The third she never had to engage at all, because he had already turned and run the moment gunfire echoed faintly from the direction of the access road. Delaney reached the reinforced steel door alone, breathing hard, hands steady, and found it unlocked, left open in the chaos of guards abandoning their post. Inside, in a room lit by a single bare bulb, she found Dr. Naomi Petrov chained by one wrist to a support pipe, thinner than her briefing photo, exhausted, staring up at Delaney with the terrified hope of someone who has stopped believing rescue was still possible. "Are you real?" Petrov whispered. "I am real," Delaney said, already working the chain free with a set of picks she had carried hidden in her boot since arriving at Ashwood 6 weeks earlier. "And you are about to tell every reporter and every congressional oversight committee that will listen exactly what Draven Systems did to save money on a defense contract." Petrov's hands shook as the chain finally gave way. "There is more," she said. "Files, encrypted drives. I hid them before they took me. I can prove all of it, the falsified testing data, the internal emails ordering the shipment despite known failure rates. It is all real. It is all documented." "Then let us go get it into hands that will actually use it," Delaney said, and helped her stand. They emerged from the canyon into gray pre-dawn light to find the situation at camp had already tipped into its final resolution. General Lange himself had appeared, flown in on a second helicopter, the moment word reached him that his operation had collapsed, standing now in the open ground between the tents with an expression of controlled fury directed at Colonel Ashford, who stood his ground with a steadiness Delaney would not have predicted from him 24 hours earlier. "This facility is under my direct authority," Lange said, his voice carrying the cold volume of a man used to obedience. "You will stand down immediately, Colonel, or I will have you relieved before this sun finishes rising." Ashford did not move. "With respect, General," he said, "my authority as installation commander supersedes your directive the moment that directive is used to conceal a kidnapping and a defective equipment cover-up that has already killed at least one soldier under my command. I have already contacted the Inspector General's office. They are aware of everything happening here." Something in Lange's composed fury flickered. The first crack of a man realizing the ground beneath him had shifted more than he understood. His eyes found Delaney, walking out of the tree line beside a woman he had believed permanently silenced, and whatever remained of his control finally broke entirely. "You have no idea what you have just done," he said, low and venomous. "Draven Systems' contract renewal protects thousands of jobs across 4 states. You are about to destroy that over a testing discrepancy that would have been resolved through proper channels." "A soldier's life is not a testing discrepancy, General," Vance said, stepping forward from the direction of the access road, weapon still in hand. "My son died because someone decided a defective component was an acceptable risk to protect a contract renewal. You just used the exact same words to describe what almost happened to Dr. Petrov." Lange had no answer for that. He looked instead toward Osgood, who had reappeared from the tree line under armed escort of 2 range instructors Vance had positioned along the perimeter, his composed professionalism entirely stripped away. "You should have let me finish this cleanly at the first camp," Osgood said, his eyes fixed on Delaney, occupying some cold territory between hatred and respect. "I knew what you were the moment I saw you on that ridge. I should have trusted my instincts and ended it before it ever became this complicated." Delaney met his gaze without flinching. "You saw a ridge in the dark," she said. "You never actually saw me." Then, before agents ever reached the tarmac, Delaney did something small and deliberate. She pulled a grease pencil from her kit, the kind used to mark ammunition crates, and wrote 4 words across the dust coating the hood of the truck Osgood had arrived in, plain enough for every soldier on that range to read as the sun came up. 8 lives. 0 regrets. She did not explain it to anyone. She did not need to. Federal agents arrived by helicopter within the hour, alerted by Ashford's call to the Inspector General, and by the response Selwork had finally released the moment Delaney's trigger transmission confirmed shots fired. The 40 minutes between that call and their arrival, the fastest a team, positioned 2 hours out, could possibly move once given the order they had been waiting all night to receive. General Lange was taken into custody on the tarmac in full view of the entire course, soldiers who would spend the rest of their careers telling this story to people who would not fully believe it. Osgood went in cuffs beside him, his composure returning just enough to offer Delaney one final look before the agents walked him toward the waiting aircraft. Dr. Petrov's testimony, delivered 11 days later before a closed congressional oversight hearing, confirmed everything the encrypted drives had documented. Draven Systems had known for 14 months that a specific manufacturing lot of long-range optic components carried a critical failure rate under low light and cold weather conditions nearly 6 times higher than published specifications. They had shipped the components anyway, rushing production ahead of a contract renewal deadline worth $400 million, and had spent the subsequent deaths quietly burying investigations through classification abuse, and in General Lange's case, direct financial incentive that federal investigators were still unwinding months later. Corporal Ethan Vance's death was formally reclassified from mechanical accident to defective equipment fatality. Master Sergeant Silas Vance stood alone at the edge of the range 3 days after the arrests, in the exact spot where his son's memorial marker had been quietly placed years earlier without ceremony, and read the amended report until the words finally, after 4 years, stopped feeling like a lie. Delaney found him there in the late afternoon light, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. He would be proud of what happened here, Delaney said finally. Not the part where I lied to you for 2 days. The part where the truth mattered enough to enough people that it finally could not be buried anymore. I spent 4 years thinking the Army had simply stopped caring, Vance said. I did not know it was something worse than that. Something deliberate. Sometimes it is both, Delaney said. And sometimes an institution finds exactly the right person to put in exactly the right place to make sure it never happens again. You did not end up teaching this course by accident, Silas. Someone knew what kind of man you were before I ever arrived, and they were right about you. Vance looked at her for a long moment, something in his weathered face settling into an expression Delaney would remember for the rest of her career. You are the best natural shooter I have trained in 22 years, he said, and I almost sent you home the first morning because your file said you were mediocre. Your instincts were right the whole time, Delaney said. You just did not have all the information yet. Neither did you, he said, and something like a real smile moved briefly across his face. Colonel Ashford was formally commended for his role in exposing the conspiracy, a commendation he accepted with visible discomfort during a small ceremony held at Ashwood 2 weeks later, standing in front of the same 11 candidates who had unknowingly trained inside the middle of a federal crime. In his brief remarks, he did something Delaney had not expected. I signed a directive I did not understand, he told them. I trusted rank over instinct, and that trust nearly cost a woman her life and had already cost a soldier his. I'm not telling you this because the Army wants a hero story today. I am telling you because every one of you will someday be asked to trust something you do not fully understand, and I want you to remember that the uniform does not automatically deserve that trust. The truth does. Always the truth. Near the front row, Malhotra and Callahan stood a little straighter at that. Two soldiers who had spent 2 days as background players in someone else's story, and had held a line under fire without hesitation when it finally mattered. And Ashford made a point, before stepping down, of shaking both their hands personally, a small correction to 2 days of being overlooked. Jonah Teague, his shoulder wrapped and his arm in a sling, stood near the back, and when Delaney's eyes found his across the small crowd, he offered her a small, exhausted grin. Told you I would blame you specifically, he said afterward, as they walked together toward the mess tent for what would be their final meal at Ashwood, before Delaney's transfer orders sent her back into whatever assignment CID had waiting next. You have every right to, Delaney said. For the record, Teague said, his voice quieter now, I am glad it was you who got assigned to my team. I did not know soldiers like you actually existed outside of stories. We exist, Delaney said. We just usually get overlooked because most people only see the file, not the person carrying it. That evening, Delaney stood alone at the edge of the range, where 4 days earlier she had watched a stranger through her scope and made the decision not to fire, the decision that had started everything that followed. Rourke's voice came through her radio one final time, businesslike and brief, confirming logistics for the following morning's transport and offering, in a rare departure from procedure, something close to genuine praise. You did good work out there, Rourke said. Better than good. The Oversight Committee is already talking about how this changes optics procurement standards Army-wide. Petrov's testimony alone is going to save lives nobody will ever know were at risk. Where do I go next? Delaney asked. You will know when it matters, Rourke said, the same answer she had given 4 days earlier, though this time it landed differently, less like a wall and more like a promise. The line went dead, and Delaney stood alone under a Wyoming sky thick with more stars than any city ever showed its people, holding a sealed envelope that had arrived with the morning's transport orders. Unmarked except for a single classification stamp she did not yet recognize. She did not open it. She simply held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of a life built entirely around walking into rooms nobody else was willing to enter, and looked out toward the dark horizon where the training range faded into open country that stretched, unbroken and waiting, toward whatever came next. Somewhere behind her, Teague called out asking if she wanted a ride to the airfield in the morning. She did not answer right away. She simply smiled, quiet and unreadable in the dark, the same expression that had once made a legendary instructor certain her file was lying to him, and turned the sealed envelope over once in her hands before finally slipping it into her jacket, unopened, and walking back toward the lights of a camp that would remember her, for the rest of every career that had touched hers that week, as the quiet woman who had turned out to be exactly the person nobody thought to look for.